Greetings to you wherever you are under the sound of my voice. Of course, it remains the Pan-African Drive, a platform that is meant to inspire and motivate the current generation of young Africans in the actualization of their respective dreams, preaching the message of peace and national unity, as well as revitalizing the Africanization policy that speaks about good governance, social justice, democracy, human rights, and most importantly, the African unity. Remember when I say, until Africans learn to own their own problems, find their own solutions, they won't be able to write their own stories. That's the essence of the Pan-African Drive. That's why we are here on Teledar TV, on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. You got to just sign in and enjoy this ride with me tonight. And we are super blessed, should I say very honored and privileged to be in a distance conversation with a young Gambian who has also climbed a very enviable height in his career and academic ladder. He happens to be Mr. Mohamed Lamin Diba, live from the European nation of Switzerland. This is the audition for you. I hope you enjoy the ride tonight. Mr. Diba, are you there, sir?
Thank you very much for having me, Antonio Mikel Howard. And hello to everyone tuning in. Like you rightly said, I am Mohamed Lamin Diba, an international development practitioner focusing on social protection, migration, and youth employment. I was privileged to work with United Nations organizations, government, and consulting firms where I focus on translating policy into impact for young people. And I'm so extolled today to join this conversation about Africa's challenges and its possibilities. Thank you very much.
That's a great one there. You hear from our guest tonight here, Mohamed Lami Diba. Quickly, Mr. Diba, you're a young Gambian, and most times, considering the constraints, the challenges across several quarters of the African continent, we're so focused on what we can get for ourselves. But you've chosen to venture their own research and studies on the migration, focus on young people's or human rights and social protection. What are the factors that revealed your desire for venturing into such studies?
Well, my interest for migration began during my undergraduate studies at the University of the Gambia. In my final year, when I was about to write my undergrad dissertation. So I made consultations actually with my professor, who was Dr. Ismail Assisi, currently the Minister of Information, Broadcasting Services. Then he advised me to write a very important topic, which was involuntary mobility and its consequences on youth unemployment. That is, young people who aspire to migrate, but they do not have the ability to do so. So I look at case studies from Cape Verde, and that was really inspiring. So I felt I could contribute not only to knowledge, but also to not only to academic, but also to policy. So I decided to carry on that research. When I completed that research, I was very happy with my work, and my supervisor was actually very extolled. So fast forward, I was engaged with International Organization for Migration for 9 months, where I focused on monitoring migration information centers in the Lower River region and the West Coast region of the Gambia, and also advocating against irregular migration of young people. Then from there, I decided to work with Dr. Cisse himself on a project, Hardline Monitoring on Migration and Reintegration Assistance Programs for Returnees, which was a very, very important project for me. And then I was able to do discourses and practices by observing border cross-border migrations within the same project. Whilst driving across the fringes of Senegambia, I was thinking about what to do in my master's degree program. And then we had a conversation that I should focus on international development, but specifically on migration
Okay.
and borders. Then that's how I decided to look for institutions that offered that course. So I came across the Geneva Graduate Institute, which offers masters exactly what I'm actually looking for: masters in international and development studies in the specialization of mobilities, migration, and borders. So this was my journey, my path towards studying and making research on migration issues.
That's quite beautiful there from you. We're going to come back to your area of specialization, but most important, we speak to you tonight on what I call Africa, richest continent in terms of all natural resources, yet with some of the poorest people of the world. That's an irony, if you like, is paradoxical in its nature. That's what we got to speak about tonight here with Mr. Mohamed Lamin Diba, live from Switzerland, and with greater emphasis on the migration, especially illegal migration that is sweeping away most of our young people across the high seas and of Africa, so to speak. So if you are joining us on Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, this is their Pan-African Drive, a platform meant to build bridges between and amongst Africa. Mr. Diba, back in on the 17th day of the month of January 1961, Patrice Emerick Lumumba of Congo says that I would rather die with my head held high, my feet unshaken, with a profound trust in the destiny of my people, rather than live in slavery. That was his last statement before he was assassinated on that day, with his body being dissolved in the sulfuric acid, the last day on the face of the planet in 1960. It translated the African governance process where there was a need for the essence of the protection of our natural resources. For too many years after that assassination, that story, that speech has not resonated with the rest of the African continent, where our natural resources have been and continue to be mortgaged to foreign counterparts outside the shores of the African continent. To what extent does it affect the development and growth of our continent, Africa?
Well, I think that was a very powerful um, statement of resilience, hope, and of course, in promoting what we called love for country and love for continent. We will continue to extol Patrice Lumumba as one of the pioneers of the great African liberation. But I'll give you a greater context about African continent. You know, Africa is one of the most diverse continents in the world, if not the most diverse continent in the world. It has 53 independent states, completely different from each other in terms of politics and in terms of governance. So each of these states have their own unique system of political administration. By virtue of that, you realize that the Gambia is only 1,100 square kilometers, and Sudan is 250 times. Sudan is 250 more bigger than the Gambia. Nigeria have a population over 230 million people, and Lesotho have a population of less than 5 million people. Botswana is an arable land, whilst Congo Kinshasa is lost in vegetation. The north of the continent is predominantly Islam, and the southern part is predominantly Christian. So that is to say, our trajectory is unique. Well, Lumumba's assertion is supposed to be a clarion call for all the Africans, especially young Africans. That is to say, we have to leapfrog from all technologies of governance into a new prosperity and chart a destiny for Africa where we will be proud of tomorrow in upholding the legacy and the dignity of this fallen hero. You see, Africa is a very wealthy continent, wealth in resources, in oil, fertile land, and the youngest population is our greatest resources. According to the World Bank and African Development Bank, Africa's population is projected to be 2 billion people by 2050. And over 70% will be, median age will be 25 years, and which is one of the greatest human resources in history. But we have to look at history and structure. Colonialism have created economies in Africa that export our raw materials and do not build industries. But in 1960 and 1961, we leapfrog from colonialism to self-determination and independence. Today, we hail the first crops of African leaders for laying this foundation for us. But however, we have seen that these resources are not being put into good use. That is not the effect of colonialism. That is as a result of poor governance, poor leadership, maladministration, and corruption, where a few elites take the resources at an expenses of the masses. So therefore, in order to solve these intractable problems, we need to have strong institutions anchored on democratic principles that respect rule of law, human rights, and the dignity of persons, so that these resources can be translated into a shared prosperity that benefits the African continent. This is the way we can pay homage and respect the legacies of our forebearers, such as Patrice Lumumba.
That's
Julius
great.
Kambara Nyerere once claimed, Julius Kambara Nyerere once claimed
Of Tanzania.
that the fundamental tragedy of Africa is not about the song we sing, but it's about who sings the song. So therefore, we should put this into perspective and ensure that we create a continent, a country that would be dignified and that resources would be used or utilized for the benefit of all and sundry.
That's great to hear from you. You are hearing from a fountain of knowledge, a young Gambian who has climbed a very massive height in his career and academic ladder. He stays in the European for Switzerland, and he speaks of us platform meant to build bridges between and among Africans. Quickly, to those of you that are watching from more Nigeria and Yoruba land, we say to you, Bao Nisha, Bao Lomo, Otutu Jomenta. Those of you I haven't seen for too long. And to the eastern part of all Nigerians that comprises Imo State, Abia State, Ebonyi State, Anambra State, and other parts of Igbo speaking parts of Nigeria, I say to you, ezigbo mmadụ ikaraka iji emechukwu abịa ma amasị amasị osimiri atata ikwu emechukwu okike odukwu akata aka strengthening all of you wherever you are to the northern part of the country that is dominantly Islamic. We say to you assalamu alaikum. To Liberians, I say to you kumanichuka koleka in Liberia Pan African Drive a platform ka jie to the Syrian, I say to you wanakushio to French speaking nations, I say to you bonsoir. Il a jeudi ça vient passer, ça s'est mis à machin to you. I say, merci de vous supporter. Thank for supporting us to Southern African nation. I say to you in the KwaZulu Natal, Sanibunane Mzanzi Geya Nembengelela. To my Botswana people there in the Setswana language, you say to you, really helabo, Elenting, Jahaho. To Swahili nations, who say to you, Jumbo, Asante Sana. Asante Sana, Asante Sara. When you quit to say, is it time for supporting us? To the Gambian and the Manjago to say to you, Mangalo, boat. To the Karunika will say to you, Alefi Olefi, Mema. To the fool as I say to you, here Jamasude, Nalaga will say me, Edema Moja, Moja. To the Mantinka will say to you, Jerejef, sorry, we say Abaraka, Ne Yanalana Dunia, we will never forget you. To the wall of we say Jerejef, Domalamona Fate, Domalamosa Fate, I don't know, I will never forget you for your support. So the rest of Africa will say, we are very grateful to you for your support. Our viewer, the diaspora viewers of all Teledar TV. This is your platform. Without you, there is no Teledar TV, and it remains your platform. Mr. Deba, when you look at a gap between pioneers of the liberation struggle of this continent and several years after their agitation for our independence, and consider the natural resources you've mentioned, Liberia, one of the greatest latex producers, rubber, across the world, and second to Malaysia, which is in Asia, and you look at the Senegal groundnut, the Gambia groundnut, Nigeria, the crude oil, and you go to Guinea-Conakry, the bauxite, and Sierra Leone diamond, Liberia diamonds, and the list goes on and on. We are so rich, yet we are so poor. It is paradoxical. And you spoke tonight highlighting corruption and inefficiency, ineffectiveness on the part of all leadership. But do you think the masses, the population of Africa, has a contribution to this unwholesome functioning society that has led us to be mere beggars across to the rest of the world? Do you think the masses have responsibility in terms of the kind of leadership that they put into power?
Well, leaders are reflections of the peoples they come from or societies they come from, actually, because we are the ones who trusted these leaderships in our various countries across the continent with the mantle of leadership to steer our affairs. So therefore, we also have the share of our blame, right? Because looking at it, let's say Congo, for instance. Congo is one of the wealthiest countries in the world in terms of mineral resources. Congo have copper, cobalt, gold, and diamonds. And these are very critical in terms of technology and in terms of technology. And then you look at Guinea, for instance, Guinea-Conakry. Guinea-Conakry also have mineral resources, right? The metals that we use for our mobile phones and aeroplanes are actually derived from aluminium, which is also extracted from bauxite that is found in Guinea. But today, Guinea is wallowing in a vicious circle of majority of the Guineans are wallowing in a vicious circle of poverty because there is maladministration, long tenure in office, which led to the deposit of Alpha Conde. We have seen the military took over in Guinea, right? And then after taking over, he defaulted the transitional period that was initially granted to him and eventually contested to elections. We have seen a similar issue that happened in the Gambia in 1994 when we became a deviant case. Jammeh took power from Sadauda Karaba Jawara, actually, claiming that there was corruption, maladministration, and bad governance. But he turns out to be the worst. His administration turns out to be the worst. And today, the Gambia is still facing the same predicament it used to face since 1965, right? And then, even though we are ushered into a new dispensation, we're still having a greater problems because our transitional justice system seems to be aborted. Our transitional justice programs, rather, seems to be aborted. Young people are still sacrificing, mortgaging their life across the Mediterranean because they don't believe in the system. But I believe that there is still a possible solution for it. Look, Africa, especially West Africa, has shown a clear example. All is not lost. For instance, Senegal and Ghana have shown that with effective leadership and strong institutions, we would be able to transform the continent into an oasis of justice. Of course, in tandem with democracy, rule of law, civic empowerment. But the moral lesson here is what Africa needs is not a perfect leader, just a system that works, that translates its resources, that benefits all and sundry, so that we could all live in dignity. Our resources should be able to translate to our resources should be able to be translated to a shared prosperity, right? This reminds me when Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1962 deposed King Farouk in Egypt and sent him to exile. What did he tell the British? We will never feel free until you go. He nationalized the Suez Canal and withdrew the British from the Suez Canals and appointed Egyptians to take charge of the responsibility of the Egyptian Suez Canal and the Egyptian economy, right? Now, what Africa needs to do is to take charge of its destiny. How do we do that? We make sure that our raw materials, we process them. When we process our raw materials, we build industries that are going to dispense and sell these raw materials at an exorbitant prices to the West, so that those resources can benefit us. And then we also have to make sure that we localize our industries, localize our products for the common good of the continent.
That's a great one, dear. From you back home in Liberia, when the first ship called Elizabeth brought home a free slave, 86 free slaves on the Liberian soil at a time called Cape Mansurado. Elijah Johnson says, "For too long have I searched for a home. Here have I found one. Here would I remain." Translating that in the context of our contemporary African politics, this is our continent. We've got a responsibility to make it grow. And the current leadership, contemporary African leadership, have done little in ensuring that our dignity, our pride, our integrity is protected and secured. Do you think, as it is quoted, it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men? Do you think the current generation of young people have the requisite arsenal to ensure that this continent is safe, secure, protected in every ramification? Do you think we're
Well,
ready?
I'll begin from history. Well, when Kwame Nkrumah led Ghana to independence, what did he say? He said, the independence of Ghana is meaningless until it is linked with the total liberation of the African continent." But later, Kwame Nkrumah was deposed and sent to exile in Guinea until he met his death. I gave you an example of Gamal Abdel Nasser when he deposed King Farouk, translate or transform Egypt into a republic from a monarch and withdraw the British from the Suez Canal. Julius Kambala Nyerere, what did he do? After warning independence for Tanzania, he came with his own philosopher to ensure that the resources are for the benefit of the masses. Right, but Africa was marred with coups and counter coups, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, that have retarded our development, right? At the time that Africa was gaining independence, some of the countries in West Africa are leapfrogging into military dictatorship. Gambia is an example, which is why our country also become paradoxical, right? So it is the responsibility of the current generation of African leaders to lay the foundation for young generation of Africans, because Africa have a youth demographic dividend, one of its greatest resources. World Bank projection, African Union projection projected that by 2050, half of Africa's population would be young people at the age of 25. So we need to invest in the right educations to make sure that these young people are equipped with the necessary tools and equipments so that they will be ready for continental and their respective national developments. But we cannot achieve that if this current leadership is corrupt. And then if this current leadership is not living up to expectations. Recently, we have seen coup d'etat in Niger, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso, and in Mali, and most recently in Guinea-Bissau. You know, so therefore, Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, need to leapfrog from coups and ensure that democratic take precedence. Military need to stay in the barracks, even though we believe that the existence of the state rested in its authorities, and therefore within these authorities, also, the military have a greater stake. But their primary responsibility is to maintain the territorial integrity of the state and serve public interests. But once this interest is diverted to private interests, therefore it defeats the purpose of democracy. In other words, democracy is lost and governance is shamed. And young people who are growing under these environments, therefore, will be left with no option, right? Then also to follow the trend, which would also retard Africa's development. And the Agenda 2063 would be very difficult to be attained
Yeah.
until and unless we have the right leadership that are willing to build institutions, that are willing to invest in young people, that are willing to give chance for democracy to thrive, as well as peace and stability. Until then, Africa would be difficult. It would be difficult for Africa to move forward as a continent.
Mr. Deep, you mentioned leadership across the continent and give several references to indicate why we are where we are. But most importantly, these leaders do not leave from the houses and get to the positions of authority. You and I vote them. And economists have said that an economist dealing with human behavior cannot attain the precision of investigation. As such, an economist, generalization of laws are conceived as conditional rather than absolute. That is what is likely to happen under a given circumstance, but not what must happen or always happen, which means the unpredictability of human nature makes it almost impossible to know how the best guy today becomes the worst guy tomorrow. Now, it begs the question, what should be the barometer for the citizenry of all nations of Africa to measure the qualitative nature of leaders or potential leader before entrusting them with the amount of authority to steady affairs of our respective nation? What should be the barometer to measuring these leaders or potential leaders?
You see, this reminds me that President Roosevelt once claimed that the government is us, not an alien power over us. That
I
the
agree
ultimate rulers
entirely.
of our yes are not the congressmen, are the voters. So therefore, the barometers, in my opinion, are how should we gauge or elect our leaders. Now, several things that we need to look at. Well, is the person educated? If he's educated, did he comes from a very good society? If he comes from a very good society, what is his track record in his previous administrations? Whether he led, institutions of government or in the private sector, what was his track record? If he ticks all the boxes, he have integrity, he's intelligent, he have a vision, then we should be able to give that person the country to lead us to a cherished destination. Well, this is how we were able to win independence. Listen, in 1929 in the Gambia, we have Edward Francis Small, who defied the odds and interrogate the colonial administration. This gave birth to the trade unions, civil society organizations, as well as independent press that advocated for people to be paid on the value of their labor. And therefore, he led one of the biggest protests in Africa with a slogan, no taxation without representation. But how were we able to allow Edward Francis Small to lead us? These are some of the qualities we need to look into our current our current leaders who are charting our destiny. Now, if you go to Ghana as well, Kwame Nkrumah collected degrees from Europe and America, went back to Ghana, and in fact, he was sent to prison just because of his subversive activities against colonial administration. But there comes a time Sir Arden Clark is left with no other option but to release Kwame Nkrumah. because of what he have demonstrated. So those leadership qualities in Kwame Nkrumah at that time, those should serve as a barometer so that we can be able to interrogate and confront the challenges we are faced with. Coming back to the Gambia, Sadauda Karaba Jawara was just a veterinary officer, but majority of the Gambians believed in him, approached him, go to his family because they believed that he have integrity and he was doing his job amicably. So therefore, we feel that he could lead us to independence, and eventually in 1963, he led us to self-determination and independence. In 1965, the Union Jack was lowered and our national flag was raised. The same thing happens to a lot of countries in the continent. So let's look at those qualities, those great qualities in the founding fathers of the African continent who laid the foundation for us so that we could live in a continent of dignity, hope, and prosperity. This is my take regarding this, Mikhail.
That's great there from my guest, Mohamed Lamin Diva. You are enjoying this ride here on the Pan-African Drive here, the platform meant to build bridges between and amongst African, like the Wolof who say, you know, you're Benin and you're Japan. Need more in Garaba. We are all one. Let's support one another. And the medication of one human is another human, which means we must be complements of one another and not to live in competition. Collective effort is very important, like the Mandinkas would say. Let's hold together. This is a Pan-African Drive here on Teledar TV. Those of you viewing us from all Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram, we massively appreciate to be on the boundaries of a thinking being. Without you, there is no Teledar TV. And back to you, Mr. Diba. When you look at the African continent, because of frustration, disappointment from several quarters, based on the leadership structure of our country, there is a push factor that is luring our young people living in their respective nations. Most importantly, also, in the West African region, the gap is very massive. They are crossing a high sea in search of greener pasture. What do you think should be done to ameliorating or reducing the massive departure of young people on a high sea, losing their lives unceremoniously in search of better life? This is our continent. We must develop it. We can't escape from our father's land. We have to grow it. We have to develop it. It's our responsibility. But on the other hand, people are saying, look, I don't think I have the enabling environment on my land in Africa, so I got to search for a better life outside the shores of Africa. What's going on? What do you think we should do to bring our young people back here?
First of all, let me make this very clear. Migration is a human right, and Article 13 of the United Nations Charter guaranteed human mobility, but of course, orderly. Migration has to be orderly. But one of the reasons why young people are migrating because they don't believe in our systems, right? Because we created a systems that that young people see that is not fit for purpose. So as a result, they rather die at sea than to, remain in a continent in search of opportunities that will enhance their lives and dignity. Right. I believe that we need to have not a perfect, but a very good social protection system, such as cash transfers, subsidies for families, and unemployment benefits, so that we could encourage young people to stay and contribute to national development. And secondly, the education system that we have is not preparing most of our young people for the job market. We have what we call skills mismatch. There are a lot of people that graduated from across universities in Africa without having decent and sustainable jobs. Their jobs doesn't correspond with what they do, and they feel that they are underemployed and they are not paid on the value of their labor. So they see Europe as an alternative, either through the Mediterranean Sea or across the treacherous Sahara Desert, losing human resources to the sea. Another factor is the social factor, actually. New label of economic migration actually argues that most migrations are family decisions, that families will come together and instigate their male children to go and send them to Europe so that the family could be emancipated from poverty. But let's ask ourselves what causes poverty. Now, it is the responsibilities of African governments to do a needs-based assessment through social protection programs and do a deliberate targeting youth at risk, families that are vulnerable, and communities that are vulnerable, so that they'll be able to promote measures that will ensure community participation and resilience, and also ensure that individuals, especially youth at risk, as well as families that are vulnerable, are supported so that young people would not risk their lives across the Mediterranean Sea or the treacherous Sahara Desert in search of opportunities in Europe. Because it's not all cool and dandy in Europe. There are strong bureaucratic measures that is pushing especially with the emergence of far rights and anti-immigration political parties in Italy, in Germany, and in Switzerland, actually. And then Europe have started to externalize their borders to third country parties like Libya, Algeria, as well as Libya, Algeria, as well as Morocco. And now they have used also Frontex to push back migrants. So the Europeans are not really interested in addressing the root cause of migration in Africa. And basically, that is not their responsibility. It's therefore the responsibilities of African government to address the root cause of the irregular migration by creating enabling environment for young people to thrive and consider staying home and contribute to national development. In the event that young people want to leave and obtain employment elsewhere, then therefore that will become an automatic choice. So therefore, legal and safe pathways must be created.
That's a good one, dear, from you. Quickly, most times when you look at illegal migration across the borders of Africa for better lives across the high sea, the responsibility almost on a 90%, if not 100% level, falls on national government. Do you subscribe to the assertion that there is a negative perception theory on the minds of young people that better lives can only be found outside the shores of the nation states in Africa, that Europe, America, and the rest of the world is only where you can have a better life? How do you reconcile such assertion when there are possibly non-Gambians who leave their respective nations and come to this country with virtually nothing, and in no time they work tirelessly and ensure that their lives become better? But people that are 100%, almost 100% put in shift to national government, how do you reconcile that?
Well, that is far from the truth. Like I said before in my earlier assertion, like Europe or America is not cool and dandy. It has its pros and cons. Some come here and get lucky. Some do not actually get lucky. A majority of the people do not actually eventually get lucky
Yeah.
because not all asylum seekers eventually becomes or are considered to be refugees at the end of the day. So once your asylum is not granted, the only option available for the Europeans is to deport you back, actually. But we also have to look from history, basically. you know Migration, with the emergence of globalization, everybody should be allowed to move freely in respect to the sustainable development goal 8, decent work and employment anywhere. I mean, you want to seek employment or jobs, right? Look at Africa, for instance. When we ended slave trade in 15th centuries, right? The Europeans introduced colonialism. We aborted that in the 1960s. They introduced what we call the so-called globalization, categorizing or profiling us as first, second, and third national countries. Like most of African countries, almost all African countries are categorized as third national countries. So therefore, they try to protect their borders so that we will not come in easily and secure them, because they see us as a threat to their social welfare systems as well as their jobs. So the best option we could do is that African governments need to conduct an assessment to understand what is exactly their problems, because the so-called 2015 migration crisis in Europe had led to the establishment of European Union Trust Fund in Africa, in Niger, in Guinea-Conakry, in the Gambia, and in Senegal. But that does not stop coup d'etats. That does not stop young people from migrating across the Mediterranean Sea. That does not stop Europe externalizing their borders. That does not stop Europe deporting us. So therefore, we should be able to conduct an assessment, because I believe in data and research, because no country can develop on earth if you are not able to do a comprehensive assessment and diagnose the intractable challenges of your country and provide a solution to it. I'll give you Gambia example. We have National Youth Service Scheme. They have been providing training opportunities for young people for far too long. But these trainings has never been translated into job opportunities. They just become abstract. So we need to depart from that and create training opportunities that would create employment for young people. Either they will be self-employed or they will be absorbed by the private sector or the government. Yes, it's understandable that the government cannot, by virtue of its size and component, even though it's the biggest employer, cannot create employment for everybody, like directly, but it can directly create employment for people through the private sector, and of course, equipping young people with necessary skills and knowledge, right? So for me, I believe that yes, Europe is not as easy as people think. Well, there are anti-immigration sentiments, just like the way Gambians also have anti-immigration sentiments towards aliens or foreigners. So therefore, we need to be very careful. And then the reason why people migrate so much is because they don't have adequate information. about Europe, because people are not actually telling them the truth, especially family networks and friends. So therefore, before you undertake the irregular migration journey or even attempt to travel through irregular means in an attempt to stay in Europe or in America, make sure you do your findings very well and have a purposeful reason to travel. That way you'll be able to make an informed choice and decision. But always remember that we have a country to build, we have a continent to build, and nobody is coming to save us. We are going to be our own saviors.
Thank you. I got to stop you there. We'll take our first break, and after which we'll return and then continue this conversation here with Mr. Mohamed Lamin Diba, live from Switzerland, as he shared his own ideas on the Pan African Drive here, where we build bridges between the most nations. We'll leave you shortly and be back. Welcome back here in the Remains of Pan-African Drive. Like we say, is a platform that is meant to build bridges between and amongst nations, and we've got to own our own problems, find our own solutions if we expect to write our own stories. And tonight, I have Mohamed Lamin Diba, a young Gambian, like I say, is a fountain of knowledge, a specialist on migration and social protection. He speaks with us tonight from Switzerland. Mr. Diba, just before we had a break here, you spoke and says that this is our continent, these are our countries. We've got a responsibility to build our nations. If you go to the lines, the first few lines of the national anthem of the Gambia that says, "For the Gambia, our homeland, we strive and work and pray that all may live in unity, freedom, and peace each day." Each day we strive, that's first person plural in English language. Don't you think it is important that young people stop shying away from responsibility, shifting blames on national government for not creating an enabling environment? Since the departure of old President Adama Barrow, we've had an enabling environment for all to thrive. Don't you think it is not important that we escape from our responsibility, we stay on this continent, because there are beggars on the streets of New York, and there are millionaires in Guinea-Bissau, there are millionaires in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in the Gambia, in Senegal, and several parts of Africa, whereas there are beggars on the street of the UK and other European nations. Don't you think we have a responsibility to stay here and develop ours as it is stipulated within our national anthem?
Well, the reason why we cannot alienate government from this responsibility is because young people entrusted them with this responsibility by giving them all our powers, our might, and resources. But again, yes, young people should believe in them and fight for a good cause and live in their countries and continent, within the continent, and achieve a desirable goal and objective for personal reasons and for the reasons for the country to develop. But obviously, it's the government that is at the helm of affairs. So it's their responsibilities within their remit to create that enabling environment for individuals to thrive, for young people to succeed. Well, Nelson Mandela claimed that um, it is better to lead people behind and others in front, especially when you celebrate victories when nice things occur. Take the front line if there is danger, then people will appreciate your leadership. So therefore, we still have to question leadership. We still have to interrogate them. We still believe they need to create the level playing field so that we could flourish. Switzerland do not have any natural resources. In fact, they are only famous for chocolates and knives, and most recently in technology. But their governments are able to create a system where everybody could thrive, even those who are not even citizens. So if Switzerland can do it without any minerals, without any oil, carbon and iron ore, in fact, Gambia have a more fertile land than Switzerland. So why could we not do it? Why can't the government not create a level playing field? we could also learn from the African countries that are doing fantastically
Of
well. We
course.
have Botswana.
Mauritius.
Botswana have never experienced Mauritius, exactly. Even Rwanda. In 1994, Rwanda was a hopeless case. My professor will
Almost a
argue that
lost nation.
exactly, even bats were not flying over Rwanda. But 30 years today, Rwanda became a model for Africa, not only for Africa, but for the entire world. Singapore in 1965 attained independence the same year with the Gambia. When Lee Kuan Yew believed that he could transform this nation, small nation called Singapore, into a country that becomes the envy of the world. And then he did it in 19, at the time of independence in America in 1977. No, sorry, in 1776, Benjamin Franklin was just at the age of 36 when he drafted the African Declaration of Independence. So young people across different continents have thrived, but because they are able to have the level playing field by people who were there before them. So I believe that if the current leadership is able to, lay a strong foundation for the next generation of leadership, then we will be able to do better, and then we will be able to depart from these old technologies of leadership into a new prosperity, and we will effectively utilize our African resources that benefits the masses of the population.
That's great. Earlier you mentioned the importance of education and thinking inwardly to work on our young people so that we have a quality of education that mold the mind of our young people and take a responsibility. Back in 2018, Lumumba of Kenya was denied entry into Zambia because the National Broadcasting Corporation was almost controlled by the Chinese government because of failure or inability to have paid the debt or loan owned by then to the Chinese government. That is how Africa has been mortgaged in almost every sector or every fabric of our society. And then back in 1964, the Liberian orator Elijah Johnson says that, as far as I'm concerned, no nation has been able to establish and maintain a strong government with a poor, ignorant population. He went further to say that the development of our nation in the future depends on the rapidity with which we must educate our people. If you look at Asia, young children at 18, 19, 20 working on smartphone, and I was taught how to draw the grasshopper and name in the various parts, head, thorax, abdomen, and all that, thorax and abdomen, so to speak. To what extent is education quite important in enhancing our capacity to seize our continent, to grab our continent from the mortgaging range it has been so that current generation of young of leaders? How important is education in this role to catalyze our energy and seizing our continent so that we can just be rich in natural resources and so poor in almost every ramification?
Well, just to tackle your fourth question, right? Looking at it from a broader perspective, Mikhail, you will realize that Africa is a very wealthy country, and we have said this before, right? But we are not effectively making best use of our resources. Now, if you look at this, right, most of our resources are not yielding dividends, right? Africa, what we do is we export raw materials at a very cheap price, but we import finished products at an exorbitant price. So if you look at it, right, it doesn't benefit African continent. Most of our wealth is benefits people outside the African continent, which is a sad reality. So therefore, that is why we need to have a very strategic education system, an overhaul, so that our education would fit for purpose, would therefore solve our intractable problems. You know. So therefore, we need to be very, very strategic. Education need to be designed in a way that, science and technology it's put at the core of everything, because when science and technology is missing in education system, it will defeat the entire processes of our development trajectory, because the world is moving at that pace, the world is moving at that trajectory. So what I'll advise African governments is still coming back to research and assessment. Let us look at what our priorities are, what we want to achieve in the next decade, and then we tailored our priorities to that, but of course not forgetting science and technology, which is very, very significant. Thank you very much.
That's great. Let me just stand up and a qualified apology there. It was not Elijah Johnson, but Dao Tuer, the 1964 Liberian orator who made that proclamation about education. Dao Tuer, not Elijah Johnson. Quickly, back into your area for specialization, migration, and human protection. What are you doing from a personal point of view to ensuring that the lives of all young people are protected, that people's minds are molded in understanding that the high sea is not the best way? What are the right policies that the government can put in place to ensure that they protect young people from the high sea? What's your thought?
Well, I think from the perspective of the Gambia government have put in a migration policy in order to ensure that young people's needs and aspirations are addressed. But the policy is therefore inadequate. Inadequate in the sense that because there was no consultations when drafting the policy. Because if you're drafting a policy that concerns a particular constituency of a population, they need to be involved, right? So I heard there is a national coordinating committee, and that national coordinating committee, with all the strategy going on, I haven't seen any of their excerpts or read from anywhere that they have gathered or myth to discuss about this current tragedy that marred our country so that they can provide a tangible solutions to it. So therefore, policies should reflect the wishes and aspirations of the people. So the policies are not effective, they are weak, right? Like I said, the European Union introduced what we call the EU Trust Fund, basically to address irregular migration across different countries within the African continent, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. But today, more young people are risking their lives dying at sea than ever before. So we need to revisit these policies. We need to revisit these programs. Advocacies alone are not enough, right? In as much as we advocate it, we tell them about the risk, right? Sometimes they don't want to believe it anymore. What young people need is pragmatism. What young people need is leadership and guidance. What they need is opportunity. Opportunity that will leapfrog them from their from decadence, from poverty into a shared prosperity. The few elites should not control the resources at an expenses of the poor masses, especially young people, youth at risk. So my advice to African governments is to reassess themselves, is to conduct a needs-based assessment and understand the intractable problems or challenges of these young people and draft policies based on that. I cannot assume that Michael Howard wants to go to Harvard University to study law without asking Michael. If I do that, I might be wrong, right? So therefore, conversations are very important. They need to communicate, they need to converse, just like the way constitutions are built. It's based on popular consent, based on consultations. It's the same way policies need to be crafted to address these monies that affect us.
We have been on this long ride here, 1 hour ride shortly. We are almost going to take leave of you. Mr. Diba, I want you to speak to the masses of the Gambia. Young people are dying. It has to be two sides of the same coins. What can national government do to change this negative paradigm shift on the lives of our young people that is resulting into brain drains, and not just for the Gambia, but across the shores of the nation state again, but across several quarters of Africa. And on the part of the citizenry, what can we do in taking responsibility to understand that success is not a respecter of geographical location? There could be hungry people on the streets of in the streets of Europe, and there are millionaires in Africa if you can utilize your inherent beauty in terms of a record charisma. Speak to young people, speak to the national government about our responsibility in your most favorite vernacular, sir.
Well, thank you very much. So Mansakunda aning funding kill it will be mo kafol the partners will ni nata development ola. So for se do ko kenyola ye nyomoy pour banko sitano nyato funding kill fani tanka kata bakono. Pour kata ki niyo wafije wala kata Sahara Desert pour kata kata faje kenseng because ni ajibe tubabul ka fami community resilience man sakunda nyanda ka satewol mako wala example jinak anim bakaw sifal men ko funding kel ka bujele ke niwta ka wafi pour kata bakono kadum pour ka try pour kadum tubabudu so enen ning community alfalu kabilo alfalu nyanda sile kacha ya jibe ebe mum ferel landila kaje ko funding kewolu tara banko kan e si banko ka e framansa jang ye balunya kendo soro pour saje e nyakana bu mu fi banda andong e kanata kila life risk ken you wafi bakono wala Sahara Desert kono so e mon fala man sakunda e ni lafta kanyum problème o kum fa ka dan wala fo kisi kisi roke e be kisi kisi role kala funding ke ol me ya lonko ya nata pour kata tubabu du e lafta kanyum duma silota eni e si eni e kacha eni nenka e to labata bundal mum nati en be sula la menna Niyo fue yata ya safe ya ke policy document then ye ferol landi ibe ma ko la nyamen ko problem ota kata ka solve, you know. So niyo problem ota ya solve njikita ko a ning bakwita abe bannale funding ke olte hamela ko take pour kata tubabu Africa seke banko di se Africa seke continent me alon ko seke dulati mobe nyaabo bola même fi Gambia fana seke banko di banko me alon ko mobe nyaabo bola fi mobe fana se hame kamlu la banko lu kan wala kamro Africa banko kan kanaka investment o kiji then Africa se yiruwa Gambia se yiruwa banko fana be Africa kono abe se yiruwa abe fana sina fasoto surtout funding ke ol.
It has been a beautiful experience having you here on a Pan-African Drive, Mr. Lami Diba. We leave you here tonight. And to you viewing us tonight, we thank you for the opportunity. And I say to you, quote of the night, it says, the beauty of this world is not what you have, but the amount of smile you are capable of putting into the faces of those around you. Translating that to the leadership of the African continent, creating smiles on the faces of the masses is not being a comedian. It's about creating the enabling environment for all to thrive. We cannot be paradoxical in our reasonings about our natural resources rich across the continent, yet our people are very poor. If you give an amount of authority to steer the affairs of your respective nations, it is important to give priority to young people, because one of the greatest responsibilities of any generation is the assurance that your children live after you will have left the face of this planet. Thank you very much. It's been a beautiful experience here on the Pan-African Drive. Those watching on Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram, this is your platform. Make it your own. See you. It's been good. Yeah, Neil Socrates. Bye-bye.